Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmstead. And today's topic, as you can see, is post-war radicalism and repression. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off with World War I. Now, in post-World War America, we were dealing with some very big issues of nativism, of racism, and we kind of sum it up. There was this huge anti-German, hyper-patriotic, 100% Americanism campaign that was during the war. And it would continue after the war in large part because of the outbreak of the Spanish flu pandemic. So just as the war begins winding down, a pandemic swept across the globe, known as the Spanish flu. It would kill nearly 50 million people worldwide over the next 2 years. Here in the United States, it was viewed very similarly to the coronavirus of 2020. It was viewed as a foreign disease that was brought back by soldiers from Europe and from immigrants. It also received varied responses from both federal and local governments. Some cities would quarantine. There were lockdowns. Some cities would reopen too soon. And each individual city seemed to allow specific rules to try to slow the spread that was also met with mixed responses from the public. For example, Philadelphia tried to reopen too soon. It was met with a second wave. But St. Louis remained closed and prevented a spike. And yes, there was even a big push to wear masks. And there were anti-maskers who hated the idea that their rights were being infringed upon. But that was just one fear. The other big fear of foreign influence was political. The rise of foreign influence, the fear of foreign influence, was furthered by the revolutions of Russia in 1917, when the Russian leader Vladimir Lenin led an overthrow of the government to install a communist dictatorship in Russia. The American government was becoming increasingly concerned about what was perceived as a proliferation of radical ideologies like communism. That was as originally conceived, that the lower classes would band together, rising up to overthrow or dismantle capitalism. And it happened in Russia, could have happened in the United States. And many Americans looked at what happened in Russia and feared the US would see a similar revolution. And so political ideologies like this were considered radical and un-American and were targeted like communism or anarchism or the burgeoning labor movement. Faced with the end of the war, prices of goods began to rise, and workers, having saved up some money from the war, were willing to strike once again for higher wages. Now, these were put down pretty quickly by President Woodrow Wilson. Again, see in the bottom right corner of your screen. But Mexican Americans included would find themselves as a major group within America's workers. Remember, a lot of them, thanks to the Great Brown Migration, have moved north and taken jobs in factories. And they are also facing extreme prejudices, such as wageism, exhaustive workloads, and no worker protections. They're going to help form and join unions and agitate for change, demanding better pay, better hours, safer working conditions. And yes, they will begin to engage in strikes, these civil acts of disobedience. Of course, they're supposed to be nonviolent, but as we've seen from history, they usually end in violence. And the problem for Mexican Americans was, once they went on strike, not only did they face the violence that their white counterparts did, but they often faced deportation, even if they were U.S. citizens. And then by 1919, you have the returning soldiers. Remember, it's poor whites, poor Anglos, who are the largest ethno-racial group to fight in the war, who were drafted. They're the ones that died by and large, and many of them come back to find that they have no jobs because their jobs have been taken over by Mexican Americans and African Americans. And this creates a lot of fights and riots. By 1919, more than 4 million workers go on strike, within thousands of labor disputes and strikes. All this pent-up anger, all this pent-up rage. And it all seems to coalesce. Of course, labor leaders are being branded as communists and radicals associated with Lenin because Lenin was promoting this. And again, theoretical communism, as it was designed by Karl Marx, was that the workers would rise up together. And here you have a widespread 4 million workers going on strike. That's a lot. And President Wilson reviews this as un-American, subversive, and often uses gunpoint to force them back to work. So much for progressivism. But as these racial ideologies begin to spread due to increased publicity, the violence increases. So much so that some people were sending bombs through the mail to target public officials. This led the U.S. Justice Department to go on a witch hunt for suspected communists, anarchists, and other radicals, leading to what we call the First Red Scare between 1917 and 1921. And this push is going to be led by Attorney General, pictured here, A. Mitchell Palmer. He will serve as Wilson's Attorney General from 1919 to 1921. He has a very harsh stance against immigrants. And labor radicalism made him a target for violence from the more radical elements, including a bomb that detonated on his porch. And so on Christmas Eve of 1919, New Year's Eve 1919, he's going to launch a police action called the Palmer Raids. Palmer is going to use illegal searches and seizures, unwarranted arrests and detentions, and other questionable methods to target suspected radicals, communists, and anarchists. He launches this action on New Year's Day 1920, when federal agents break into the house and meeting places of thousands of suspected revolutionaries in 33 different U.S. cities. The hope here was to expose the extent of revolutionary activity in the United States. On New Year's Day 1920, more than 4,000 people are arrested and held in jail for weeks, with never being charged for a crime. And in the course of this roundup, federal agents only found a handful of guns, no rifles, and no explosives. Out of 4,000 people, he would deport 556. Apparently, Palmer had exaggerated the internal threat of radicalism in the United States, a recurrent theme in U.S. history. But what it did do, the Palmer Raids, is illustrate the widespread fear of radicalism and immigrant communities in the United States, underscoring the ethnic, racial, and class divides in the United States. But Mexican Americans were also involved in the Palmer Raids. Because in the Palmer Raids is the belief that the U.S. was under attack from within. Many Mexican Americans would support the Palmer Raids and even contribute to it, trying to say that, we're not suspect here. We're good Americans. Even though they knew firsthand the sting of raids into their community looking for undocumented immigrants to deport. Remember that temporary admission program and the suspect nature of radicalism thanks to the Mexican Revolution? Mexican Americans are living in a very tenuous position in 1920. They're seen as potential subversives. And they want to prove their loyalty to the United States or deflect the attention from themselves. And then there's one more big thing. We talked about the Great Migration of African Americans and the Great Brown Migration of Mexican Americans. Do you really think they were received in the North with open arms? No, of course not. In 1919, we will see a wave of riots across the United States, the largest of which is in Chicago, 1919, in which 38 people were killed and 537 injured. Another 25 race riots will erupt across the country, and not only in the North. In Texas, in Longview, East Texas, local Anglos invaded the black section of Longview, and in the process burned down shops and houses and ran several African Americans out of town. A week later, another riot in Washington, D.C., because of reports that a black person had assaulted a white woman. There was a 4-day race war in the streets that required troops to quell the violence. This was an incredibly violent time, fueled by racism, the Red Scare, the labor movement, the Soviet Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia, and this general post-war unrest and uncertainty. And all of this post-war disorder resulted in profound disillusionment that pervaded American society in these post-war years. Now, this map is mostly about African American race riots. But in the Southwest, it was just as violent, fueled by historic racism and, of course, the Texas Rangers, leading to a period from about 1915 to 1929 known as La Mantanza. La Mantanza is this huge uptick in violence between Anglos in Texas and everyday average Mexicanos. It's not always involving the Texas Rangers, but most often involving the Texas Rangers. So let's talk about the Texas Rangers for a moment. They are considered Texas's oldest law enforcement agency. They were established in the 1820s by Stephen F. Austin himself. Now, they were established for the purpose of protecting U.S. whites who had been recruited to the Texas area under the impresario system. The goal originally was to use the Rangers to protect U.S. whites from Native American attacks. That was the original intent. But over time, they would be used for all sorts of things, including border patrol. They would be used as military during the Texas Revolution of 1836 and the Mexican-American War of 1846. They'd be used as slave patrols in the pre-Civil War era. They'd be used against Indians in the Indian Wars to oust the Indians from Texas. They were used as bodyguards and, of course, strikebreakers. Not only in Texas, but even we saw in the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado. And they have a very noticeable reputation. By the early 1900s, they had developed a reputation as being a superb law enforcement agency and some super tough guys. They had a reputation of being almost invincible. They were known as being fearless, the men's men, the toughest of the toughest, the bravest of the brave. They were manly men. Their slogan was "One Ranger, one shot," used to illustrate the bravado of the Rangers, because it was said that all a Ranger needed was one shot to put down a riot. That's how good they were. But what the other side of the thing is that they often were heavily involved in a race war, an ongoing race war between white and brown-skinned people. Because the Rangers were mostly an outfit made up of Anglos. But to be clear, and I want to be full disclosure, not all Rangers were just Anglo. There were a good number of Spanish surname Rangers, including Ranger Chapa, and Ranger Diaz, and Ranger Iniosa. And please note, the Texas Rangers did not only go after Mexicanos. They also targeted African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, and even whites as well. They targeted anyone suspected of being involved in a plan that would be subversive or an insurrection or harboring suspected plan organizers. Who do you think was working the race riot in Longview in 1919? That's the Rangers. But what really causes La Mantanza is the Mexican Revolution in World War I. Because that aftermath of the revolution in World War I ratchet up the violence and crimes against Mexican and Mexican Americans. In other words, they increased their worst impulses to combat the so-called radicalization of revolutionary Mexican and Mexican Americans in South Texas. For example, in 1915, the Rangers discovered what was called the Plan de Santiago, or San Diego, the Plan of San Diego. And the Plan de Santiago of 1915 to the Rangers constituted a clear act of war. It was a race war. And for the Rangers, they considered a clear war of a race that they deemed inferior to whites. So what is the Plan de Santiago? It was put together by a group of unidentified Mexican and Tejano rebels who what they wanted to do was to secede Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas. Again, essentially the U.S. Southwest that had been gained during the Mexican-American War. This group of unidentified Mexicanos wanted to use this area, secede it from the United States, and to create a racial utopia for Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, and African Americans. The plan called for the execution, though, of all white men over the age of 16. It also called for an army of Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Japanese, along with the restoration of historic tribal Indian land. So let me repeat this for a minute. Let me put it in very simple terms. They have a plan to kill all white people over the age of 16, all white males over the age of 16, in an attempt to get rid of whites from the region, to take the historic Southwest of the United States and make it into a racial utopia, a home for Native Americans, Asians, African Americans, and Mexican Americans. But listen to the point number 10 of their plan. Point number 10 said, quote, "The movement, having gathered force, and once having possessed ourselves of the states alluded to," again, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, "and once having possessed ourselves the states alluded to, we shall proclaim them as an independent republic, later requesting, if it be though expedient annexation, to Mexico." Boy, this sounds like a lot what Anglos did to Texas in 1836. They want to take over the land by sheer numbers, declare it as independent, take it over by force, and then hold it annexed by the United States. In the Plan de Santiago, they want to kill all whites over age 16, take over the area numerically with their racial ethno groups, and then form an independent nation, and then, if it be expedient, to be annexed by Mexico. They are doing exactly what Sam Houston did and the other Texans did in 1836. But this caused mass hysteria across Texas. And it fell to the Texas Rangers to quell the violence and end the rebellion. And this became a war of extermination, as the Texas Rangers will target mostly Mexican American men, looking to eliminate them completely. Women, too, were victims of Ranger violence. There were mass hangings, bodies that were lassoed and dragged behind horses, bodies thrown into flaming pyres and left to rot and burn. Relatives were too terrorized to even bury the remains. Rangers were given a license to kill, to use their weapons with little or no concern for any criminal charges to be filed against them. First of all, they have no right to shoot people, but they took it anyway. And they knew that even if they did murder people, there would be no charges against them. They would go on to kill between 5,000 and 10,000 people in South Texas between just 1915 and 1917. The thing that quelled the violence was not the Texas Rangers giving up. It was direction diverted to World War I as the U.S. entered the war in 1917. It was a mentality of shoot first, ask questions second or later. It would terrorize Mexicano communities. The Texas Rangers of the Mantanza period were to Mexican Americans and other Mexicanos what the KKK was to African Americans. The only difference was one group was wanted by the law and one group was the arm of the law. The KKK were technically an illegal terrorist group that law enforcement looked the other way. The Texas Rangers, they were the law enforcement group. Historians estimate that hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed during this period. And this doesn't even include the 232 ethnic Mexicans who were lynched in Texas. This is extreme violence. And guys, it's only going to get worse through the Mantanza period. We're going to stop here. When we come back, talk about 1918 massacre. So until then, take care and bye-bye.